The great chamber of the Galactic Council on Ethais Prime was never truly quiet, not even on the calmest of days. 342 species filled the circular hall in tiered rows that climbed toward a ceiling made of living crystal, and every session brought with it the hum of translators, the shuffle of alien bodies, and the constant murmur of politics dressed up as diplomacy. On this particular morning, the session was as boring as any other. Councillor Thissaron, the Speaker of the Galactic Concord, stood at the central podium on his 4 segmented legs, his insectoid wings folded neatly behind his back as he guided the assembly through a dispute over shipping lanes near the Orith Nebula. His voice was smooth and practiced, the voice of someone who had spent 2 centuries turning conflict into conversation and action into committee. Ambassador Ilara Voss sat in the human delegation's modest seat on the lower tier, the section reserved for what the council politely called developing members, and what everyone else called junior species. Humanity had joined the Concord 80 years ago, a blink of an eye by galactic standards, and in all that time they had been patted on the head, spoken over, and quietly ignored whenever it suited the older races. Voss did not mind the seat. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back tight, and her face carried the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. Before she had become a diplomat, she had served as a military judge, and she had learned long ago that silence was louder than shouting if you knew when to use it. She was reviewing a trade proposal on her datapad when the lights in the chamber shifted from white to deep amber. Every delegate knew what that color meant. Priority emergency transmission. Thissaron paused mid-sentence and tilted his angular head toward the communication officers stationed below the podium. One of them, a young Pelori with trembling fins, looked up at the speaker and said something too quiet for the chamber to hear. Thissaron straightened. "The council will receive an emergency broadcast from Sector 14, he announced, and his translator carried the words to every ear and audio receptor in the room. All scheduled business is suspended. The central holographic display flickered to life, and the chamber fell into an uneasy hush. The first image was a planet green and blue with swirling white clouds, a world that looked painfully like Earth. Text appeared beside it. New Thessaly, human frontier colony, population 1.2 million. Then the image changed. The green surface was scarred with black craters, entire cities reduced to smoldering rubble, forests burned to gray ash stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Distress signals played over the speakers, frantic human voices screaming for help, calling out names, begging anyone to respond. Drone footage followed, captured by automated survey units that had arrived after the attack. Streets filled with bodies, homes torn apart by orbital bombardment, a school with its walls blown inward, and small shapes scattered across the floor that no translator needed to explain. Chemical defoliant had been sprayed across the agricultural zones, turning farmland into poison that would last for decades. And then the footage showed the ships responsible, the long dark cruisers of the Zarathi Dominion, their hulls marked with the red claw sigil that half the galaxy had learned to fear. The Zarathi were a reptilian species built like nightmares, tall and armored with natural bone plating, and they had built an empire not through trade or alliance but through violence and the threat of more violence. This was not the first time they had done something like this. 50 years ago they had wiped out the Ilwari, a peaceful aquatic race whose homeworld now sat empty and poisoned. 30 years ago they had scattered the Drenith, burning their colony worlds until the survivors became refugees begging for shelter across the galaxy. Both times the Council had responded with sanctions, formal condemnations, and sternly worded resolutions that the Zarathi had ignored completely. Both times the Council had offered mediated dialogue and called it justice. Now they had come for the humans. The footage ended, and the chamber was thick with silence. The kind of silence that comes not from shock but from guilt, because everyone in that room knew exactly what was going to happen next. They were going to do nothing meaningful, again. Thisarin broke the quiet with practiced gravity. "This is a deeply concerning development," he said, and his wings shifted in what the Velhari considered a gesture of sorrow. "The Conquered extends its sympathies to the human delegation and calls upon both parties to exercise restraint." Both parties. Voss heard those words, and something behind her eyes went very still. A recorded transmission from War Prince Drekthar was played next. He appeared on the holographic display, massive and gleaming, his yellow eyes half-lidded with the lazy confidence of a predator who had never once been made to answer for his kills. "The territory designated as New Thessaly falls within the historical expansion corridor of the Zarathi Dominion," he said, his deep voice rattling through the translators. "The human settlers were occupying our sovereign space without authorization, and we exercised our right to reclaim what is ours." He smiled, or at least he made the expression that Zarathi used when they wanted you to know they were enjoying themselves. "However," he continued, "the Dominion is not unreasonable, and we are willing to enter negotiations with the human government to discuss future boundaries and reparations." Reparations. He had killed 1.2 million people, 400,000 of them children, and he was offering to sit at a table and talk about it. This was his pattern: destroy, then extend a hand so the council could pretend the system worked. Thisarin nodded slowly, as if this were a reasonable and encouraging development. "The council welcomes the Dominion's willingness to engage in dialogue," he said. "I propose the formation of a mediation committee to facilitate discussion between the Zarathi Dominion and the United Earth Government, with full arbitration rights granted to the Conquered." 17 species seconded the motion before the echo of his words had faded. It was happening again. The same script, the same theater, the same slow burial of the dead under layers of procedure and politeness. In the human delegation section, Voss set down her datapad. She pressed her fingertips together and stared at the holographic image of Drekthar's smiling face for a long moment, and anyone watching her closely would have noticed that her hands were perfectly steady. That was the part that should have frightened them. She stood. The motion sensors tracked her rise, and her delegation's indicator light turned from passive blue to active green, signaling a request to address the chamber. Thisarin glanced down at her with the particular expression that older species reserved for humans: patient, slightly amused, the look of an adult watching a child raise their hand in a room full of grown-ups. "The Council recognizes Ambassador Voss of the United Earth Government," he said. Voss walked to the speaker's rail at the edge of her tier. She did not hurry. Every step was measured and deliberate, her boots clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that somehow made the vast chamber feel smaller. She reached the rail and looked out across the assembled delegates. Hundreds of species, thousands of representatives, the greatest governing body in the known galaxy. She did not look angry. She did not look sad. She looked like someone who had already made a decision that the rest of the room had not yet understood. "Thank you, Counselor Thisarin," she said, and her voice was calm and clear, carrying through the chamber without effort. She paused, and in that pause the silence returned, heavier now, weighted with something that several of the older delegates would later describe as dread without knowing why they felt it. "The United Earth Government has authorized me to deliver the following formal statement to the Galactic Conquered," she said. She reached into her jacket and produced a single folded document, real paper, an almost extinct medium that humans still used for declarations they considered sacred. She unfolded it, and the chamber waited. Ilara Voss held the unfolded document in both hands and read it the way a soldier reads an oath, without passion, without hesitation, and with the absolute certainty of someone who means every single word. Directive 7 of the United Earth Government, also known as the Iron Doctrine, is hereby invoked and entered into the record of the Galactic Concord. She began. The translators carried her words to every corner of the chamber, and already several delegates were leaning forward in their seats because the humans had never invoked anything before. They had always nodded, agreed, cooperated, gone along with whatever the council decided. Not today. On the 14th day of the 9th Galactic Standard Month, Voss continued, forces belonging to the Zarathi Dominion conducted a deliberate and systematic extermination of the civilian population of New Thessaly, a lawfully established colony of the United Earth Government. She did not look up from the paper. 1.2 million human beings were killed, including approximately 400,000 children under the age of 16. The number hung in the air like smoke. The United Earth Government does not recognize the Zarathi Dominion's claim to any authority, territory, or right to dialogue, following a deliberate act of genocide against a civilian population. Now she looked up, and her eyes swept the chamber with the slow precision of a searchlight. Humanity does not negotiate with those who murder its children. The silence in the chamber was so complete that delegates on the upper tiers could hear the hum of the station's environmental systems. Effective immediately, Voss said. A state of total war exists between the United Earth Government and the Zarathi Dominion, and this state of war will continue until every individual responsible for the massacre at New Thessaly is captured or destroyed. She folded the paper once and placed it on the speaker's rail. This is not a request for council arbitration, she said, and now her voice carried something new, not anger, not grief, but a cold and absolute finality that made the translators struggle to find equivalents in a dozen alien languages. This is a notification. The chamber erupted. Thissaron's wings flared wide, a Velhari expression of alarm that he had not shown in over a century of political life. Ambassador Voss, the Concord does not permit unilateral military action by member states, he said, his voice rising. You will withdraw this declaration immediately and submit to the arbitration framework as required by the founding charter. Voices overlapped from every tier species shouting objections, demanding explanations, calling for order. The Malthari delegation slammed their ceremonial staffs against the floor in protest. The Orvani ambassador covered her facial vents, a gesture of profound distress. Voss waited. She stood perfectly still at the rail while the chaos swirled around her, and she waited with the patience of a woman who had spent years sitting in courtrooms watching guilty people try to talk their way out of consequences. When the noise finally began to fade, she spoke again. I understand the council's concern, she said, and I want to address it directly. She took one step forward. 47 years ago, the Zarathi Dominion exterminated the Ilwari species, and the council responded with a formal condemnation and trade sanctions that the Zarathi ignored within 6 months. Another step. 29 years ago, the Zarathi burned 11 Drenith colony worlds, killing over 30 million civilians, and the council formed a mediation committee that produced a 200-page report recommending further dialogue. She stopped. The Ilwari are extinct, every last one of them gone from this galaxy forever, and the Drenith are scattered refugees living on borrowed land because no one in this chamber had the courage to do anything more than talk. She turned and looked directly at Thissaron. Your arbitration did not save the Ilwari, counselor, and it did not save the Drenith, and we will not stand here and allow it to fail a third time while our dead are still warm. Thissaron stared at her, and for the first time in his long political life, he had nothing to say, because she was right and every delegate in the chamber knew it. The session dissolved into chaos, but the declaration stood. Humanity was going to war. Far from HFY Prime, in a region of space that the galactic maps labeled as the human frontier territories, the dreadnought Unconquered hung in the darkness like a sleeping predator. She was not a beautiful ship by galactic standards. Human warships never were. But she was built with a philosophy that the other species had never quite understood. Where most galactic navies designed their vessels to intimidate, to project power through size and decoration, human ships were designed to do exactly one thing with maximum efficiency: kill. Captain Mateo Reyes stood on the bridge of the Unconquered with his hands clasped behind his back, reading the orders that had arrived 7 minutes ago on a priority channel, so encrypted that the ship's own AI had needed 40 seconds to decode it. He was a lean man in his early 40s with dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone. And he read the orders twice, not because he did not understand them, but because he wanted to make sure he felt what he was supposed to feel before he acted. Total war. He had known this day would come. They all had. For decades, the United Earth government had watched the Zarathi Dominion do what it did. And for decades, the military planners and intelligence analysts and war college professors had asked the same quiet question: what do we do when they come for us? The answer was the Iron Doctrine, and every senior officer in the fleet knew its contents by heart. Reyes set down the orders and looked at the tactical display. The Third Fleet, 12 dreadnoughts, 40 cruisers, over 200 support vessels, and enough drone carriers to darken a sun, was already assembling at rally points across the frontier. This was not a rushed response or a panicked mobilization. This was a plan that had been rehearsed in secret for 20 years, a machine that had been built one piece at a time, waiting for the day someone gave it a reason to start. What the galaxy did not know, what no one outside of Earth's military command had ever been told, was how far ahead humanity actually was. The other species had always assumed that humans were technologically inferior, a young race still catching up to the galactic standard, and humans had never corrected that assumption. The truth was different. Human ships carried stealth systems that could fool every sensor array in known space. Their weapons used targeting algorithms linked to artificial intelligences that could process a battlefield faster than any living mind. Their drone swarms operated with a coordination that bordered on telepathy, thousands of units moving as one, adapting in real time to any threat. And their hyperspace drives, the drives that every galactic engineer said could not be improved beyond a certain threshold, had been quietly redesigned to bypass interdiction fields, the energy barriers that every species used to prevent enemies from jumping directly into their territory. The galaxy thought it knew what humans were capable of. The galaxy was wrong. Reyes turned to his first officer. "Signal the fleet," he said. "Execute Operation Burning Answer Phase 1. Across human space, ships that had been waiting in silence for years powered up their engines and began to move. Back on HFY Prime, the council session had ended in disarray, and Ambassador Voss sat alone in the human delegation's quarters, staring at a photograph on her personal terminal. It showed New Thessaly as it had been 6 months ago: green hills, white buildings, children playing in a park near the colony's central lake. She touched the screen once, then closed it. There was a knock at her door, and she opened it to find Ambassador Selkai of the Drenith Remnant standing in the corridor. He was small, barely reaching her shoulder, with gray skin and large dark eyes that carried the permanent sadness of a species that had lost almost everything. "I watched your address," he said quietly. "I know," Voss replied. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached out and took her hand, a human gesture that he had learned during his years on the station. "Make them remember us," he whispered. "Make them remember the Ilwari and the Drenith, and make the galaxy remember what it costs to look away." Voss held his hand and nodded once. 12 hours later, the Third Fleet dropped out of hyperspace, not at the border of Zarathi territory, not at the edge of their outer defenses, but deep inside their inner systems, less than 3 hours from Zarathi Prime itself. Every sensor station, every patrol fleet, every early warning satellite in the Dominion had failed to detect even a single human ship. The Zarathi had not even known they were coming. And now it was too late. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came to the Zarathi, not through their military channels, but through their civilian traffic control network. A cargo hauler passing through the inner system detected a gravity distortion that should not have been there, and when it adjusted its sensors to investigate, the distortion resolved into the shape of a warship, then 12 warships, then a fleet so vast that the hauler's computer simply stopped counting and began broadcasting an emergency signal on every frequency it could reach. The Third Fleet materialized inside the Zarathi defensive perimeter like ghosts, stepping through a locked door. Captain Mateo Reyes stood on the bridge of the Unconquered and watched the tactical display paint the enemy positions in red across the holographic map. Around him, his crew worked in focused silence, every station active, every system running at full power, and the only sound was the low, steady hum of a ship that was very good at what it had been built to do. "Open a channel," Reyes said. "All frequencies, military and civilian, translated to Zarathi Standard." His communications officer nodded, and a moment later the broadcast light turned green. Reyes spoke, and his voice carried across the entire Zarathi home system, reaching warships and space stations and ground installations and civilian receivers all at once. "This is Captain Mateo Reyes of the United Earth Government Third Fleet," he said. "We are not here for your territory, and we are not here for your resources, and we have no interest in your empire or your politics." He paused. "We are here for your killers." The words hung in the void between the stars. Every officer and every soldier who participated in the attack on the human colony of New Thessaly is to surrender themselves immediately to the nearest human vessel, and if this condition is met, no further blood will be spilled. He cut the transmission and waited. The response came 11 minutes later, broadcast from the orbital citadel of War Prince Drekthar himself. Drekthar appeared on the screen with his jaws open in what passed for laughter among the Zarathi, his massive body shaking with amusement as he stared into the camera. "Little humans," he said, "you come into my home with your little ships and make your little demands, and you think this frightens me." He leaned forward. "I have broken species older and stronger than you, and I will break you the same way. And when I am done, I will hang your captain's skull above my throne as a reminder to every race in this galaxy that the Zarathi do not answer to insects." The transmission ended. Reyes looked at his first officer, a woman named Commander Priya Anand, whose expression had not changed once during Drekthar's entire speech. "He said no," Reyes observed. "He said no," Anand confirmed. Reyes nodded. "All ships, execute battle plan Nightfall." The Battle of Zarathi Prime would later be studied at every war college in the galaxy for the next 300 years, not because of its scale, but because of how completely it shattered every assumption that the galactic community held about warfare. The Zarathi home fleet was enormous, over 500 capital ships supported by thousands of smaller vessels, a force that had crushed every enemy it had ever faced through sheer, overwhelming power. They fought the way they always fought, forming massive battle lines, firing devastating broadsides, and charging forward in a wall of armor and firepower that was meant to break an enemy's will as much as their ships. It was a strategy that had worked against the Ilwari, the Dreneth, and a dozen other species who had tried to resist. It did not work against the humans. The Third Fleet did not form a battle line. It scattered. Human ships moved in small, coordinated groups of 3 to 5 vessels, darting between the Zarathi formations like wolves circling a herd, and they struck not at the enemy's strongest points but at their weakest: sensor arrays, communication relays, engine clusters, ammunition stores. The Zarathi fired their broadsides into empty space because the human ships were never where they were supposed to be. Every time the Zarathi tried to bring their superior numbers to bear, the human groups would split and reform somewhere else, drawing the larger ships out of formation and picking them apart from angles they could not defend. Then the drones came. Carriers at the rear of the human fleet released swarms so dense they appeared on Zarathi sensors as clouds. Thousands of autonomous units linked together through artificial intelligence networks that allowed them to think and adapt faster than any living crew could react. The drones did not try to destroy the Zarathi ships. They blinded them. Electronic warfare packages jammed sensors and scrambled targeting computers, while physical units attached themselves to hull surfaces and cut through weapon power conduits with precision lasers. Ship after ship went dark, drifting helplessly as their weapons failed and their engines sputtered, and their crews screamed into communicators that no one could hear because the jamming had taken those too. And through it all, the Unconquered moved like a surgeon's blade, targeting the Zarathi command ships with strikes so precise that they disabled propulsion and weapons without breaching the hulls. Reyes was not trying to kill everyone aboard those ships. He was trying to leave them alive, floating and forced to watch as their fleet fell apart around them. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the Zarathi home fleet had been reduced from a fighting force to a field of drifting wreckage and disabled hulls, and humanity had lost 23 ships, a number that the galactic analysts would later call impossibly, frighteningly low. On Ethais Prime, the Galactic Council had gathered in emergency session to watch the battle through long-range sensor relays, and the chamber was silent in a way it had never been before. Not the polite silence of diplomacy or the uncomfortable silence of disagreement, but the deep and hollow silence of beings who were watching their understanding of the universe come apart. Thissaron stood at his podium with his wings pressed flat against his back, a Velhari posture of pure distress, and he stared at the tactical display as the last Zarathi command ship went dark. "This is not possible," whispered the Malthari ambassador to no one in particular. "They are a junior species." Ambassador Voss sat in her seat and said nothing, and her face showed nothing, and her hands remained folded in her lap as steady as they had been on the day she read the declaration. She did not need to speak. The display was speaking for her. Thissaron found his voice. "The Council demands an immediate cessation of hostilities," he announced, though the words came out thin and uncertain. "Humanity must stand down and allow the conquered to mediate this conflict before further." "No," Voss said. Just the one word, spoken from her seat without rising, and it cut through the chamber like a blade. Thissaron turned to her. "Ambassador, the Conquered's charter." "The Conquered had decades to stop the Zarathi from killing," Voss said, still seated, still calm, still terrifying. "It chose arbitration, and arbitration chose to let species die, and we choose differently." No one responded. Far from both the battle and the politics, on the burned surface of New Thessaly, human ships were landing, not warships but recovery vessels, medical transports and forensic teams. They spread across the ruins of the colony with scanners and cameras and sample kits, and they began the slow and terrible work of documentation. Every body was photographed, tagged, and identified where possible. Every mass grave was mapped and measured. Every piece of evidence, spent Zarathi ammunition casings, chemical weapon residue, boot prints in the ash, was collected and cataloged with the precision of investigators who knew that every piece of data would matter in a courtroom. And then humanity did something that the Council had spent decades making sure no one ever did. They released it all. Unedited and uncensored footage of New Thessaly's destruction was broadcast across the entire galactic communications network. Every station, every homeworld, every ship with a receiver. The galaxy saw the craters where neighborhoods had been. The galaxy saw the poisoned farmland that would not grow anything for 50 years. The galaxy saw the school. For the first time, species who had only ever heard about Zarathi atrocities in carefully worded council reports were seeing what those atrocities actually looked like. And the effect was like a shockwave that moved not through space, but through conscience. On 100 different worlds, ordinary beings watched the footage and felt something shift inside them. The comfortable distance between themselves and the victims collapsed, and what was left was the raw and undeniable truth that this had happened because no one had stopped it. In his orbital citadel above Zarathi Prime, War Prince Drekthar watched his broken fleet drift and felt something he had never experienced in his entire life. Fear. Not of death. Zarathi did not fear death, but of something worse. Irrelevance. He activated his long-range communicator and transmitted a message, but he did not send it to the humans. He sent it to the Galactic Council. "This is War Prince Drekthar of the Zarathi Dominion," he said, and for the first time his voice carried no amusement and no contempt. "I am invoking the Conquered Mutual Defense Clause and requesting immediate military assistance against the unlawful aggression of the human species." He was begging. The predator who had laughed at the deaths of millions was begging the very institution he had mocked for a century to save him. And across the galaxy, everyone was watching to see what the Council would do. The Mutual Defense Clause had been written into the founding charter of the Galactic Concord 4,000 years ago, and in all that time, it had been invoked exactly twice. Once during the Spore Crisis of the Third Millennium, and once during the boundary wars that had nearly torn the galaxy apart. It was the most powerful legal tool in galactic civilization, a binding agreement that required every member species to contribute military forces against an aggressor if the Council voted to activate it. And now Drekthar, the butcher of 3 species, the War Prince who had ignored every Council resolution ever passed against him, was asking the galaxy to use it on his behalf. The emergency session convened within the hour. Every seat in the great chamber was filled, and the observation galleries above were packed with aides, analysts, and journalists from 100 different worlds, all of them aware that what happened in this room in the next few hours would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy for generations. Thissarin called the session to order, and for once the chamber did not need to be quieted because no one was speaking. The silence was heavy and electric, charged with the kind of tension that comes when everyone in a room knows they are about to be asked a question they do not want to answer. The Zarathi Dominion has formally invoked the Mutual Defense Clause. Announced, under the terms of the Charter, the Council must vote on whether to activate the clause and mobilize a joint defense force against the United Earth government. He paused, and his compound eyes swept the chamber. The floor is open for debate. The arguments came quickly, and they split the chamber down lines that had nothing to do with right or wrong, and everything to do with interest and fear. The Vithani Collective spoke first, their ambassador rising on 6 limbs to declare that order must be preserved above all else. If one species can declare war unilaterally and face no consequences from the conquered, then the charter is meaningless, he said. Today it is the humans acting alone, but tomorrow it could be anyone, and the precedent we set here will echo through history. The Malthari Trade Federation agreed, though their concern was less philosophical. The Zarathi controlled 3 major trade corridors, and a prolonged human occupation would disrupt commerce across an entire quadrant. Several smaller species nodded along, not because they loved the Zarathi, but because they had spent their entire existence relying on the conquered structure for protection, and watching a single species tear through that structure terrified them more than any war prince ever had. On the other side, the arguments were quieter but no less powerful. The Orvani ambassador, an elderly female whose species had escaped Zarathi attention only through geographical luck, stood and said simply, "We have all seen the footage from New Thessaly, and if we vote to protect the ones who did that, then we deserve whatever comes next." The Pelori delegation agreed, and so did the Keth, and so did a dozen other species who had spent decades watching the Zarathi grow bolder, while the council grew more passive. But the vote was too close to call, and everyone knew it. The chamber buzzed with whispered calculations and shifting alliances, and Thissaran watched from his podium with the expression of someone who could feel the ground moving beneath his feet. He was afraid, not of the Zarathi and not of the humans, but of the choice itself, because he had spent his entire career believing that the Conquered's greatest strength was its ability to absorb conflict through process and patience, and now that belief was being tested against a species that had simply refused to play along. He leaned toward activation, not because he sympathized with Drekthar, but because he feared what it meant if the Conquered could not control its members. "Before we proceed to a vote," he said, "the council will hear from the party in question." He turned to the lower tier. "Ambassador Voss, you have the floor." Voss stood and walked to the speaker's rail for the second time, and the chamber watched her with an intensity that it had never directed at a human before. She did not carry a document this time. She carried a small audio device, no larger than her palm. "I will be brief," she said, "because what I have to say does not require many words." She placed the device on the rail. "Before I speak, I want this council to hear something, and I want every delegate to listen to its entirety without interruption." She pressed a button. The sound that filled the chamber was not dramatic at first, the hiss of static, the muffled thud of something heavy hitting a door, and then voices, human voices, speaking in quick, frightened tones that the translators rendered for every species present. "How many are inside?" 6,000, maybe more, mostly kids and elderly, everyone who made it to the shelter. "The doors are rated for orbital bombardment. They cannot get through." A louder thud, then another, then a grinding metallic shriek that meant something very strong was tearing through something that was supposed to be unbreakable. Screaming, not the controlled panic of adults trying to stay calm, but the raw, desperate screaming of children who knew that something terrible was on the other side of the door. A crash. More screaming, louder now, mixed with sounds that no translator could soften, the heavy footsteps of Zarathi soldiers, the discharge of plasma weapons, the wet, terrible sounds of violence done to bodies that could not fight back. A child's voice, small and clear above the chaos. "Mama, where are?" Static. The recording lasted 47 seconds from the first thud to the final silence, and when it ended the chamber was so quiet that delegates on the upper tiers could hear their own heartbeats. Voss let the silence hold for 10 seconds, then 20, then 30. Some delegates looked away, and some covered their sensory organs, and some sat perfectly still with expressions that transcended species. The universal look of beings confronted with a horror they could not unsee or unhear. Ambassador Selkai of the Drenith was weeping openly, gray tears running down his face, because he had heard recordings like this before from his own people's history, and he knew exactly what that static at the end meant. Voss spoke. "You are afraid of us," she said, "and I understand that because we are efficient in war and we do not posture, and we do not bluff, and when our children are murdered we come for those responsible and we do not stop." Her voice was steady, calm, and completely without mercy. "But I want every delegate in this chamber to ask themselves one question before they cast their vote." She paused. "In the 80 years since humanity joined this Conquered, have we ever started a war?" Silence. Have we ever threatened another species? Silence. Have we ever conquered a single world, or stolen a single resource, or harmed a single being who did not first raise a weapon against us? Silence, because the answer to every question was no, and everyone in the room knew it. You know what we are, Voss said. We are builders and explorers and traders and neighbors, and we have been all of those things since the day we joined this Concord. She pointed to the audio device on the rail. The Zarathi have attacked 4 species in 50 years, and each time this council responded with sanctions and dialogue and committees and reports. And each time the Zarathi waited for the attention to fade, and then did it again. Her hand dropped. The Ilwari followed your process, and they are gone, every one of them forever. And the Drenith followed your process, and they are broken, and now you are asking us to submit to the same process that failed them. She shook her head. We will not. If you choose to stand between us and the ones who did this, she said, gesturing to the now silent audio device, that is your right under the Charter, and we will not pretend that we can fight the entire galaxy. But know this, we will not stop, and every ship you send against us is a ship that is protecting the killers of children, and history will remember which side of this you chose. She returned to her seat. Thissaron stared at the audio device on the rail as if it were a bomb, and in a way it was, because it had detonated something inside the chamber that no amount of procedural language could reassemble. The vote will proceed, he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. One by one, each species cast their decision through the electronic voting system, and the results appeared on the central display in real time. The Orvani voted no, they would not protect the Zarathi. The Pelari voted no. The Keth voted no. The Drenith voted no, and Selkai's hand trembled as he entered it. The Malthari, who had argued for activation, hesitated, and then voted no. The Vithani, who had spoken so passionately about precedent and order, abstained. Species after species after species rejected the clause, and the count climbed not gradually, but in a cascade, like a dam breaking, as delegates who had been uncertain saw which way the tide was moving and found their courage or their fear, or whatever it was that made them choose. The final count was 312 against activation, 19 in favor, and 11 abstentions. It was not close. It was a landslide. Read the result and set down his speaking rod, a gesture that, in Velhari culture, meant the acceptance of something painful and irreversible. The motion fails, he said. The mutual defense clause will not be activated. Somewhere in the upper galleries, a Drenith aide began to applaud, a human gesture that the Drenith had adopted decades ago, and within moments the sound spread, not to the full chamber but to enough of it that the message was clear. Drekthar was alone. His transmission, still technically open on a diplomatic channel, dissolved into static as someone on the Zarathi end cut the connection. In the human delegation's quarters, Voss sat down and closed her eyes for just a moment, and for just a moment the mask cracked and something raw and exhausted showed through before she sealed it away again. Her communicator chimed. A message from Captain Reyes. Council vote received, proceeding to final phase. The Citadel is powering weapons. He is choosing to fight. Voss typed back 2 words, end it. Above Zarathi Prime, the Unconquered turned its bow toward the orbital Citadel, where War Prince Drekthar had sealed himself inside with his personal guard, and the Citadel's weapon batteries were glowing hot, charging for a last stand that everyone except Drekthar knew was already over. Reyes opened one final channel. War Prince Drekthar, you are charged with the genocide of 1.2 million civilians on New Thessaly, and you are ordered to surrender yourself and all officers involved in the attack, and this is your final opportunity to do so. The Citadel's weapons fired. Reyes closed the channel. All ships weapons free. The Citadel was a fortress built to survive the death of stars, a massive orbital structure armored with layers of plating that could withstand bombardment for days, and its weapon batteries threw walls of plasma fire into the void with enough force to crack a moon. Drekthar had built it as a monument to his own invincibility, and now he was using every system it had to prove that monument right. It lasted 14 minutes. The Third Fleet did not try to batter through the Citadel's defenses with brute force, because brute force was never how humans fought. Instead, drone swarms descended on the station in waves, identifying weapon emplacements and feeding their positions to the fleet's targeting network in real time. And one by one, the batteries went silent as precision strikes found the gaps in the armor where power conduits ran close to the surface. Electronic warfare ships jammed the Citadel's sensor grid so completely that the Zarathi gunners were firing blind within the first 3 minutes, pouring plasma into empty space, while the human fleet moved around them like water flowing around a stone. When the last weapon battery went dark, Captain Reyes gave the order that he had been waiting to give since the day he learned his sister had died on New Thessaly. Boarding teams go. The breaching pods launched from the fleet in coordinated salvos, punching through the Citadel's hull at 12 different points simultaneously, and human marines poured into the station's corridors with a speed and violence that the Zarathi defenders had never experienced. The Zarathi were physically larger, stronger, and covered in natural bone armor that could stop a knife blade, and in any other era of warfare that would have mattered. It did not matter here. The Marines moved in fire teams of 4, linked through neural communication implants that allowed them to share tactical awareness without speaking, and they cleared corridors with a systematic precision that turned every Zarathi advantage into a liability. The Zarathi fought in the open because their species had always relied on their size and their armor, but the humans fought from cover and used angles and crossfires that the defenders could not see until it was too late. Automated combat drones moved ahead of the Marine teams, drawing fire and mapping enemy positions, so that every engagement was over before the Zarathi understood it had begun. It was not a battle. It was a hunt. Drekthar's personal guard, 300 of the most elite warriors in the Dominion, made their stand in the throne room at the center of the Citadel, a massive chamber lined with the trophies of Drekthar's conquests, weapons taken from defeated species, banners from destroyed worlds, and in a glass case near the throne, a small carved figure that had once belonged to an ill-wary child. The guard fought with everything they had, and they fought well, because Zarathi warriors did not know how to do anything else, and the throne room became a killing ground where both sides bled. The Marines took casualties, 17 dead and 41 wounded in the final assault, and every one of those names would later be etched into a memorial wall on Earth beside the names of the New Thessaly dead. But the guard fell, one by one, then in groups, then all at once as the last defensive line collapsed, and the surviving Zarathi dropped their weapons and stood in silence among their fallen. And in the center of the room, standing before his throne with a ceremonial blade in his hand, was War Prince Drekthar. He was wounded, human rounds had found the gaps in his bone armor, and his blood, dark and thick, pooled on the floor beneath him. But he was standing, and his yellow eyes burned with a fury that had no surrender in it. He looked at the Marines who surrounded him and raised his blade. "I am Drekthar," he snarled, War Prince of the Zarathi Dominion, conqueror of the Ilwari, breaker of the Drenith, and I will die on my feet as a warrior, not in some cage built by vermin. Captain Reyes stepped through the breach in the throne room wall, his armor scarred and dusty, and he looked at the War Prince the way a man looks at something he has been waiting a long time to see. "No," Reyes said. He gestured, and 2 Marines fired stun rounds that hit Drekthar in the neck and chest, and the War Prince's legs buckled and he crashed to the floor, still conscious but unable to move, his blade clattering away across the stone. Ray stood over him. "You do not get to die a warrior," he said quietly. "You killed 400,000 children on New Thessaly, and you will answer for every single one of them in a courtroom in front of the entire galaxy, and you will hear their names read aloud one by one until there are no more names to read." He turned to his Marines. "Secure the prisoner and prep for extraction. We are done here." The aftermath unfolded over weeks, and it changed the galaxy in ways that no one fully understood until much later. The Zarathi Dominion collapsed, not because humanity destroyed it, but because humanity removed the man who had held it together through fear. Without Drekthar and his inner circle, the Dominion fractured into a dozen competing factions. Regional warlords who turned on each other almost immediately, in a scramble for power that consumed whatever military strength the Zarathi had left. Humanity did not occupy a single kilometer of Zarathi space. The Third Fleet withdrew completely once the prisoners had been secured, pulling back behind human borders as if the most devastating military campaign in modern galactic history had been nothing more than an errand. This was perhaps the detail that frightened the galaxy most of all, not the power humanity had shown, but the restraint. They had proven they could destroy the Zarathi Dominion entirely, wipe them from the stars the way the Zarathi had wiped the Ilwari, and they had chosen not to. They had taken only what they came for, the ones responsible. Drekthar and 147 Zarathi officers were transported to Earth, to a courthouse in The Hague that had been built centuries ago to try war criminals from humanity's own bloody history. The trial was broadcast on every galactic channel in real time, and it was nothing like what the galaxy expected. There was no spectacle, no theater, no vengeful rhetoric from the prosecution. The trial was methodical, meticulous, and devastatingly thorough. Evidence was presented piece by piece: sensor logs from the attack, communication records showing Drekthar personally ordering the bombardment of civilian zones, chemical analysis of the defoliants used on the farms, DNA identification of the dead matched to population records, and the testimony of the 17 survivors who had been pulled from the ruins. The Zarathi officers were given legal representation, human lawyers, because no Zarathi attorney had the training or the standing to operate in the court, and those lawyers fought for their clients with genuine dedication, because that was how the system worked, and humanity wanted the galaxy to see that it worked even when the defendants were monsters. When it was Drekthar's turn to face the evidence, the prosecution played the recording, the same 47 seconds that Ambassador Voss had played for the council, and then they read the names. Every name. 400,000 children, read aloud one after another in a process that took 11 continuous days and required rotating teams of readers, because no single human could do it without breaking. Drekthar sat in his restraints and listened, and somewhere around the third day his expression changed, not to remorse. Perhaps he was not capable of that, but to something that looked like the understanding that this would be his legacy, not conquest, not power, but this room and these names and the galaxy watching him hear them. The verdicts came down, guilty on all counts, every officer, every charge. The sentences ranged from life imprisonment to permanent exile, and Drekthar himself received the maximum, solitary confinement for the remainder of his natural life, in a facility designed to ensure that remainder would be very, very long. Back on Ethais Prime, the council had watched the entire trial in something approaching awe, because no species in the history of the conquered had ever responded to genocide by capturing the perpetrators and giving them a fair trial. The expected response was annihilation. That was what empires did. That was what the Zarathi themselves would have done. And instead the humans had built a cage out of law and evidence and put the monster inside it where the whole galaxy could see. Counselor sat in his quarters after the verdict and stared at nothing for a long time. His aide, a young Velhari who had served him for 20 years, finally spoke. "Counselor, the session tomorrow." "We failed," Thisaran said quietly, and his wings hung limp against his back in a posture of absolute defeat. "For decades we chose comfort over justice and called it diplomacy, and species died because we did not have the courage to act, and then the humans came along and simply refused to make the same choice." He turned to his aide. "And the worst part is that they were right." On the same day, Ambassador Selkai of the Drenith Remnant formally requested that evidence of Zerathi atrocities against his people be included in the trial record. Voss agreed within the hour, and for the first time in 30 years the Drenith dead were named and counted, not in a council report that no one read, but in a courtroom that the entire galaxy was watching. Selkai attended the session in person, sitting in the gallery with his hands folded and his dark eyes fixed on the screen as name after name appeared. Drenith names, Ilwari names, human names, all of them together, all of them finally counted. 2 weeks after the trial concluded, a galactic standard broadcast was transmitted from Earth on a priority channel that reached every receiver in known space. Every station, every homeworld, every ship, every outpost. It was classified as a formal notice from the United Earth government, and it read, "Let it be known to all species, governments, and entities within the galactic concord. Humanity does not seek war, and humanity does not seek empire, and humanity extends its hand in friendship and cooperation to all who approach in good faith. But humanity does not negotiate with those who murder the innocent, and humanity does not forget, and humanity does not stop. This is not a threat, it is a promise. Govern yourselves accordingly." On Ethais Prime, in the Great Chamber of the Galactic Council, 342 delegations sat in their seats as the alert chimed on every console simultaneously. The crystal ceiling caught the light and scattered it across the room in patterns that shifted like living things, and the hum of the translators was the only sound as every delegate read the message in their own language. Read it twice. The Orvani ambassador read it and nodded once. The Malthari read it and sat very still. Ambassador Selkai read it through tears and held the small carved figure that the human marines had recovered from Drekthar's trophy case and returned to him. An Ilwari child's toy, the last physical artifact of an extinct species, now held in the hands of someone who understood what it meant. Ambassador Voss sat in humanity's seat on the lower tier, the section for junior species, and she did not look up because she did not need to see the room to know what was happening in it. The message glowed on every screen. The chamber was full, 342 species, thousands of representatives, the greatest governing body in the known galaxy. And not one of them said a single word.